reality, Israel's in a lot of trouble. They have probably fired more missiles and dropped more munitions in the last 2 weeks than we can manufacture in 2 years. And so they're running out.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really digging into something that, well, it challenges a lot of what you might hear elsewhere about Israel's military, its strength, and America's whole strategy in the Middle East.
Absolutely. We've got some sources here, particularly insights from Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a retired U.S. colonel, serious operational experience in the Gulf War that paint a frankly startling picture.
Startling is a good word. He's basically putting forward what he calls a forbidden truth. The idea that Israel isn't this invincible force, but is actually pretty desperate.
Yeah, he talks about them being nearly out of missiles. I mean, firing more in just a couple of weeks than the U.S. can even make in 2 years. That's a huge claim.
It really is. And he doesn't stop there. He mentions their economy collapsing, people fleeing the country. It's a radically different narrative.
And it flies right in the face of, the official line, especially around the recent ceasefire with Iran.
Right. You had President Trump celebrating it as this big diplomatic win. His genius, he said. But Macgregor, he says, no, that wasn't negotiation. That was Israel needing to survive. A last-ditch move.
Mm-hmm. And his warning goes even broader, suggesting America itself is like a runaway train headed down the mountain.
Yeah, that nobody really believes anymore. It's heavy stuff.
It absolutely is. So our mission today is to really unpack all of this. Look at Macgregor's claims, the other source material we have on the Israel-Iran conflict, and try to understand these, challenges to the conventional narrative.
We need to explore the economics, the military realities he's talking about, the geopolitics, because according to these sources, the picture is dramatically different than what you usually see.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond those headlines, questioning what we think we know, and figuring out what might really be driving events in the Middle East and, maybe even globally.
Okay, so let's start right there with that ceasefire.
Yeah.
Because the contrast is just so stark. You've got President Trump publicly taking a victory lap.
Right. Al Jazeera reported him saying he wouldn't let Iran resume its nuclear program. He even called himself the architect of Indo-Pakistani peace, suggested he could fix Ukraine.
Yeah, very confident. Saying Tehran would choose diplomacy sounds like a done deal, a solid negotiation.
But then you have Macgregor, and his take is, completely different. He flat out says the ceasefire wasn't because Trump had some brilliant idea one morning.
So what was it then, according to him?
He basically calls Trump a brilliant master of media manipulation, says he just, took credit for the good stuff, ignored the bad. Standard procedure in Macgregor's view.
Okay, so not diplomacy driving it, but maybe desperation and PR spin covering it up.
That seems to be Macgregor's core argument there. It wasn't a strategic choice based on strength, but maybe a necessity born from weakness, which was then repackaged for public consumption.
And the facts on the ground right after the announcement, they don't exactly scream stable peace, do they?
Not at all. Fox News reported it almost collapsed within hours. Hostilities flared up again before the truce even properly took effect.
We saw Israel continuing military actions, and then Iran hitting back hard, right? That rocket attack on the hospital in Beersheba, killing people.
Tragically, yes. At least 4 killed there. And Al Jazeera noted Israel was actually gearing up for a full-scale response just before Trump stepped in.
So it sounds less like a negotiated peace and more like someone hitting the pause button while everything's still on fire. A forced pause, maybe?
That's certainly how it looks when you put those pieces together. It suggests the underlying conflict, the tensions, they hadn't been resolved at all, which leads us straight into Israel's strategic situation.
What Macgregor says is incredibly bad.
Exactly. He says, I don't think anybody's addressing that because nobody really understands how bad it is, and the Israelis certainly aren't going to tell you. That implies a huge hidden vulnerability.
A vulnerability they can't afford to admit publicly.
Precisely. Because admitting it could, invite further pressure or attack, it changes the whole perception of their strength.
So what shape does this vulnerability take? He mentions the economy specifically. Says their economy is about dead. That sounds extreme.
It does sound extreme, but it's not entirely without corroboration. We looked at a report from INSS, that's Israel's Institute for National Security Studies. Not exactly an anti-Israel source.
Right, an Israeli think tank. What do they say?
They talk about the economy bearing a heavy toll. They list direct war costs, the huge disruption from having so many reserve members called up and out of the workforce.
Yeah, that must have a massive impact.
Huge. And they also mention this growing perception of instability that's actually hurting Israel's global reputation.
Okay, so maybe not dead, but certainly under severe strain.
Severe strain, definitely. The INSS report warns about continuous declines in investment, potential boycotts, especially hitting their vital high-tech sector.
Ouch. That's their crown jewel.
It is. Plus, disruptions to supply chains and, crucially, unsustainable increases in defense spending. It paints a picture of, multiple economic pressures converging.
And that unsustainable defense spending loops right back to the military situation, doesn't it? Especially the replenishment issue Macgregor raises.
Absolutely. He highlights their dependency. He says, basically, as long as Israel influences the U.S., we will try to replenish their funds and ship them whatever we can, munitions and missiles.
So they need that constant pipeline from the U.S. just to keep going.
It seems that way, based on his assessment. And think about that earlier claim, firing more missiles in 2 weeks than the U.S. makes in 2 years. If that's even close to accurate, it shows an incredible burn rate.
A burn rate that outstrips supply. That's a serious problem in any conflict.
A fundamental problem. The INSS report echoes this need, talking about the necessity of combat pauses, specifically to restock supplies and restore operational readiness.
So even Israeli analysts see the need to pause just to reload, essentially.
It points to a real logistical constraint. It's not just about having the money. It's about the physical hardware, the missiles, the ammo, and the time it takes to get them where they need to be.
Okay, so Israel facing economic strain, potentially critical munition shortages, needing pauses. How does Iran look in comparison, according to Macgregor?
He paints the exact opposite picture. He says Iran is in the opposite position, possessing, in his words, almost inexhaustible quantities of missiles.
Almost inexhaustible. How?
He claims they've been building this arsenal for 20 years, specifically preparing for this kind of conflict, a long-term strategic investment in missile technology and production.
20 years. While Israel might be burning through stockpiles, Iran has been building them up. That's quite the asymmetry.
It is. And you have to ask, what's the basis for that inexhaustible claim? Well, the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, gives some context.
What do they say about Iran's missiles?
They identify Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force, the IRGC-AF, as the main operator here. And they confirm Iran has invested tremendously over many years to assemble the largest missile inventory in the Middle East.
The largest in the region.
Okay. And they haven't just been sitting on them. ISW notes they conducted their first missile strike abroad in decades back in 2017, and they've hit targets in Iraq, Syria, even Israel itself since then. It's become a key tool for them.
So they have a huge stockpile, and they're not afraid to use it. It's part of their force projection strategy.
Exactly. That documented history of investment and operational use lends significant weight to Macgregor's point about their preparedness in terms of missile capabilities. It suggests a deep, long-term strategic focus.
It's a chilling thought, really. One side potentially running low, needing resupply, the other sitting on a massive, decades-in-the-making arsenal.
It completely reframes the power dynamic, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
But then, if Iran has this advantage, why agree to a ceasefire? Why not press that advantage?
That's the million-dollar question. Macgregor suggests Iran isn't necessarily looking for total war right now. He thinks they're ultimately interested to regain some measure of stability in the region.
Stability, even with that missile advantage.
Perhaps stability on their terms. Or maybe they're playing a longer game. He also mentions external influence, that they're listening to wise counsel from Putin and Xi Jinping, especially Putin.
Ah, okay. So maybe Russia advising caution, suggesting a pause, aligns with broader geopolitical goals. Not necessarily weakness on Iran's part, but strategic calculation.
That seems to be his interpretation, a calculated pause influenced by powerful allies rather than a move forced by exhaustion or military necessity, like he suggests was the case for Israel.
This really shifts the perspective. Israel potentially desperate, Iran strategically patient and well-stocked. It leads back to that fundamental question Macgregor asks.
Can Israel survive this?
Yeah, he says nobody really understands how bad it is. It sounds almost existential.
It does. He takes it beyond just military hardware and economics. He brings in demographics, societal factors.
Whoa.
He points out the numbers. Israel, out 9 million people, but only 7 million Jews, 2 million Arabs. Iran, 92 million Muslims. His conclusion is blunt. It's not going to prevail. It's not going to work.
Wow. That's a very stark assessment based on population size and composition, implying a long-term demographic imbalance.
It's a controversial point, for sure, but it feeds into his overall argument about long-term viability. And it's not just about external numbers. It connects to internal issues within Israel, too.
Like the divisions the INSS report mentioned.
Exactly. That report highlights deepening political and ideological divisions, particularly around the government's judicial overhaul plans. Remember those huge protests?
Of course. Massive disruption.
And the report mentions public attacks on key institutions, like the security agencies, disputes over things like the conscription law for the ultra-Orthodox.
So internal friction weakening the state from within.
That's the concern raised by INSS. They say public trust in the country's core institutions is rapidly eroding. And that initial unity seen right after October 7th, it's faded.
So the external pressures are mounting, while internal cohesion might be fraying. That adds another layer to Macgregor's how bad it is question.
It certainly does. And then there's the economic vulnerability we touched on earlier, but from a different angle.
What angle is that?
Human capital. The INSS report calls this Israel's primary economic asset, but it's also mobile and in demand globally.
Meaning their best and brightest can just leave.
Precisely. Which makes brain drain a key vulnerability. The report says tackling this has to be a top priority for the government.
So it's not just people fleeing immediate danger, it's the potential long-term loss of the skilled workforce that drives their economy, especially tech.
Exactly. If the instability, the economic strain, the internal divisions become too much, that crucial human capital might just walk away. That feels like it connects directly to Macgregor's assessment of how serious the situation is.
It's a confluence of military, economic, societal, and now human capital pressures. It's a lot.
It really is. And Macgregor adds another explosive element to this mix, the nuclear dimension.
Yes. Israel's undeclared nuclear arsenal. What's his take there?
He claims Israel held on to this nuclear monopoly, and they like the monopoly because it allows them to bully others, threaten others, drive them down a road they would otherwise not go.
So accusing them of using nukes not just for deterrence, but for regional coercion. Bullying, essentially.
That's the accusation, and he says Iran is the one that has finally stood up and said, no, we will not accept that.
Which sets up an incredibly dangerous dynamic, right? Especially if Iran pursues its own nuclear capability.
Absolutely. Macgregor explicitly raises that possibility, Iran getting nukes, leading to a mad scenario, mutual assured destruction. If you use it against us, we'll use it against you, and you will vanish. Terrifying logic.
Terrifying. And he even suggests outside powers are trying to manage this, mentioning Putin warning Netanyahu.
He implies it, yes. A private warning from Putin to Netanyahu. Don't use nukes on Iran. If true, that's huge. High-level back-channel diplomacy trying to keep the lid on the ultimate Pandora's box.
It really underscores the stakes. We're talking regional survival, potentially nuclear exchange.
And Macgregor ties this perceived Israeli influence and the nuclear issue back to U.S. foreign policy, specifically what he calls the Israel First approach.
How do you frame that?
He tells this story, an anecdote about a Republican National Convention. He describes seeing a giant Israeli flag on the wall, a big sign above it saying Israel First.
Seriously, at a U.S. political convention.
That's his recollection. He describes a speaker coming out and saying Israel first, and the reaction being sort of what? He compares it to imagine seeing Mexico first or Cuba first at a convention.
Yeah, that would seem odd. What's his point with that story?
His point seems to be that this focus on Israel is unique, unprecedented, and maybe even strange in American politics. It highlights his perception of an unusually prioritized relationship that might not always align with broader U.S. interests.
Interesting. And that perception feeds into his larger argument about America's global standing, right? The runaway train idea.
Exactly, that feeling that nobody believes America anymore. He portrays the U.S. not as a confident leader, but as this out-of-control train heading for disaster.
And he even suggests Trump, despite the tough talk, sees the danger. The oil monster,
Yeah.
the nuclear monster.
Yeah, he suggests Trump is actually very much afraid, and that's why he wanted the ceasefire. Not strength, but fear, and a recognition of perhaps limits to American power.
That's a complete inversion of the public image.
It is. It suggests a leadership grappling with forces it maybe can't control, contributing to this decline in global trust and credibility Macgregor perceives.
And is this idea of declining U.S. influence just Macgregor's view, or do other sources see it?
Well, the INSS report, interestingly, touches on this too, from an Israeli perspective. They talk about the post-Cold War period, U.S. hegemony sparking backlash.
Backlash, why?
Because the U.S. struggled with protracted, costly, and inconclusive wars abroad, while also dealing with deep internal societal rifts back home. Think Iraq, Afghanistan.
Right, draining resources and attention.
Exactly. And INSS says that over time, opposing forces began to challenge American dominance, both economically and ethically. So it's seen as a longer-term trend, not just a recent thing.
A gradual erosion of that unchallenged superpower status.
Precisely. And the America First policies seem to have poured gasoline on that fire, according to some analyses.
Like the Credendo report you mentioned.
Yeah.
The risk assessment group.
Yeah. They argue that Trump's America First agenda, especially his reluctance to provide security guarantees to U.S. allies, is actually hastening the decline of the U.S.-led international order.
Hastening the decline, so making it worse faster.
That's their assessment. They say U.S. credibility and legitimacy are being weakened in the long term. It's not just about perception, it's about tangible trust evaporating.
And what are the consequences of that eroding trust?
Credendo points to some specific concerning trends. They see Western allies starting to build new military alliances without the world superpower, hedging their bets, basically.
Moving away from reliance on the U.S.? And what about adversaries?
They expect enhanced military cooperation between Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And a side effect, less effective Western sanctions. If these countries band together more tightly, sanctions lose their bite.
So allies drift away, adversaries get closer. That sounds like a major reshaping of the global landscape.
It certainly points in that direction. And Credendo adds that Trump's preference for transactional deals, using coercion, that further damages the trust needed for real alliances. Partners feel like bargaining chips, not allies.
It paints a pretty bleak picture for U.S. global standing. And speaking of trust, let's circle back to Iran's nuclear program and those U.S. strikes. The messaging there was confusing.
Massively confusing. You had Trump claiming complete and full obliteration of Iran's nuclear facilities, doubling down on it.
But the intelligence reports told a different story.
Yeah, a leaked U.S. intelligence report suggested the strikes only set Iran's program back by months, not years. Huge difference. And the UN nuclear watchdog head, Grossi, was skeptical too, calling it subjective in the eye of the beholder.
Months versus obliteration. That's not just spin. That's a fundamental disagreement on the facts.
It really is, and it raises questions about why the public statements were so different from the intelligence assessments.
Were there attempts to explain that discrepancy?
Well, you had Defense Secretary Hegseth suggesting the leaked intel was being spun to make the president look bad, claiming political motivation. Trump himself attacked the media for reporting it, called it disgusting.
So politics trumping intelligence assessments, potentially. Trying to control the narrative above all else.
It certainly looks like a possibility, and the AP reported something interesting. Britain apparently trusted U.S. intelligence, despite Trump dismissing the leak.
So even close allies might be looking at the official U.S. statements versus the U.S. intelligence and siding with the intel. That creates friction.
Huge friction. How can you coordinate strategy if you don't trust what your main ally is telling you, or if their leader is contradicting their own agencies?
Okay, so let's get specific about those strikes.
Yeah.
Trump claimed obliteration. Macgregor said,
Macgregor was blunt. He said that's just not true. We haven't destroyed the nuclear capabilities. He claimed it looked like the U.S. hit 3 or 4 empty buildings. The stuff wasn't there. It was
moved. Implying Iran knew or suspected an attack was coming and relocated sensitive materials.
That's the strong implication, that the strikes, while maybe hitting infrastructure, missed the crucial nuclear components. A major intelligence failure, or perhaps very effective Iranian counterintelligence and operational security.
And does other evidence support that idea of limited impact?
Well, those early U.S. intel reports suggesting only a few months setback align with Macgregor. Plus, the IAEA in Saudi Arabia reported no discernible uptick in radiation levels afterward.
Which you'd expect if major nuclear material sites are hit hard.
You might, although experts say hitting buried sites carries lower radiation risk. Still, the lack of detected radiation adds to the picture of maybe less damage than claimed. It all points towards the strikes being potentially far less effective than the obliteration narrative suggested.
So which sites were actually targeted? Places like Natanz, Fordo?
Reports mention several key locations. Natanz, the main enrichment site. Fordo, the one buried deep in a mountain, Trump specifically said, Fordo is gone. Isfahan, for uranium conversion. Kondab, the heavy water reactor site. And the Tehran Research Center.
So hitting the known facilities. But if Macgregor's right and the critical stuff was moved, hitting the buildings might have been almost pointless.
From the perspective of crippling the program, yes, it would be a symbolic strike, perhaps, but not a decisive one, which leads to Iran's reaction.
How did they respond, beyond just words?
Well, their foreign minister called the killings of scientists and officials state terrorism at the UN, asserting their right to self-defense. But more concretely, their parliament voted to close the Straits of Hormuz.
Wow, okay. Threatening to choke off a massive amount of the world's oil supply. That's a serious escalation.
A very serious threat. And then there's the longer-term consequence, the one that's maybe the most worrying.
The incentive to actually build the bomb.
Exactly. You see discussions, like on Reddit, reflecting this idea that attacks like these just push Iran towards weaponization. Macgregor makes this point powerfully.
What does he say?
He says the lesson Iran takes away is, gosh, I better get a nuclear weapon or I, too, am going to end up like Libya. Remembering Gaddafi gave up his WMD program and was later overthrown.
The ultimate cautionary tale for regimes facing external pressure. So the strikes, meant to stop the program, might actually accelerate it. Perverse incentive.
It's a deeply concerning potential outcome, the law of unintended consequences in full effect.
And Iran's strategy isn't solely nuclear. There's the whole axis of resistance, their proxy network. How extensive is that?
It's very extensive, built up over decades since 1979. The Wilson Center details this network allies among militias in at least 6 countries: Bahrain, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestinian territories, Syria, Yemen.
So a presence across the entire region, how do they maintain that?
Through Iran's Revolutionary Guards, especially the Quds Force. They provide arms, training, money. They nurture these groups.
And who are the key players in this network?
Groups you hear about often: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Asayib al-Haq, and the Badr organization in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in the Palestinian territories. These are major regional forces.
And the U.S. has been trying to counter this for years, right? With sanctions.
Absolutely. Multiple presidents, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, have used executive orders to sanction leaders like Nasrallah from Hezbollah, al-Houthi, Sinwar from Hamas, plus financial networks supporting them, a sustained effort to disrupt the network.
Okay, so Iran has this extensive proxy network. But didn't the INSS report say that network was collapsing? That contradicts Macgregor again.
It does. That's a direct contradiction. INSS claims Iran's military capabilities failed to deter Israel, and crucially that the proxy strategy has failed to constrain Israel's actions, even saying the network collapsed.
Failed. Collapsed.
Yeah.
That's strong language. They also mentioned Assad's regime falling in Syria, weakening the axis.
Yes, they point to the downfall of Assad as another blow to Iran's regional influence through that axis. So you have INSS saying the network is basically finished, ineffective.
And Macgregor suggesting Iran is strategically strong, patient, well-armed. How do we reconcile these two views?
It's incredibly difficult. Is it a total collapse, as INSS suggests? Or is it a setback, and Iran, playing the long game, can rebuild or adapt? The reality is likely complex, somewhere in between.
So we have to hold both possibilities in mind. Iran facing setbacks, maybe significant ones, but perhaps not completely out of the game strategically, especially given Macgregor's assessment of their missile strength and patience.
Exactly. Acknowledging the conflict in the source material is key here. But regardless of the exact state of Iran's proxies, Macgregor circles back to this very dark warning for the U.S.
The runaway train.
Yeah. We're a runaway train headed down the mountain. I don't know how we get off this track before we hit the bottom. In fact, I don't think we will. It's incredibly fatalistic.
And he connects this not just to foreign policy decline, but to something imminent back home.
Yes. He predicts, in the distance, could be a week, could be 10 weeks, is this financial crisis and potential economic implosion in the U.S.
Wow. An imminent financial collapse. Weeks away. That's extremely specific and alarming.
It is a very dire, very near-term prediction. But we have to balance that against other economic viewpoints.
Right. You mentioned Forbes had a different take.
Yeah, Forbes painted a picture of much greater U.S. economic resilience. They argued that, unlike past oil shocks, the current surge in U.S. oil production makes higher prices more neutral for the U.S. economy overall.
Okay. And what about household finances?
Forbes noted household net worth was near all-time highs, and people's ability to handle debt was actually better than before the pandemic. Their conclusion: markets see a relatively low risk of a U.S. recession.
So a direct contradiction to Macgregor's imminent implosion forecast. One sees resilience, the other sees a cliff edge just ahead.
A fundamental disagreement on the immediate economic outlook. However, even if immediate collapse isn't happening, there are still those bigger, long-term challenges.
Like the ones INSS mentioned about globalization.
Exactly. The pandemic, the wars. They've shown how fragile global supply chains are. ISS says this erodes confidence in globalization and pushes countries towards more independent risk management, needing more resilient, maybe shorter supply chains.
A long-term shift away from hyperglobalization towards more national focus.
Potentially. It's a trend many are observing, and this ties into internal cohesion, too.
How so?
The INSS report talks about that deep rift within the democratic world, the conservative versus progressive tension, extremism influencing the mainstream. That internal division, especially in the U.S., weakens its global standing regardless of the GDP figures.
And those internal divisions play out in economic policy debates too, right? Like over the Trump tax cuts.
Precisely. The AP reported on that huge split. The White House claimed billions in deficit reduction from the cuts, but the Congressional Budget Office projected trillions in increased deficits, hitting lower-income folks hardest.
So even on basic economic facts and forecasts, there's deep political disagreement within the U.S. system that doesn't exactly scream stability or clear direction.
It contributes to that sense of uncertainty, maybe even the runaway train feeling, even if the immediate financial crash Macgregor predicts isn't universally seen as inevitable.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground here. It really feels like this deep dive has peeled back layers on the Israel-Iran situation, U.S. credibility, exposing complexity and contradiction.
Absolutely. We've seen how the ceasefire narrative might be much more about Israeli desperation, according to Macgregor, countered by Iran's alleged long-term buildup.
We looked at Israel's internal pressures, economic, societal, the brain drain risk, and then this stark view of America's fading global influence and Macgregor's warning of financial crisis.
Contrasted, of course, with analyses suggesting more U.S. economic resilience, it really highlights how official stories can mask deeper realities.
And understanding these underlying currents, these conflicting views, it seems absolutely vital for anyone trying to make sense of, well, where the world is heading. It feels incredibly unpredictable right now.
It does, and perhaps the key takeaway for you, listening, is to constantly question the narratives presented, to look for those hidden factors, the unacknowledged pressures Macgregor points to.
So the final thought to leave you with, building on all this, if Macgregor's right, even partially, about this runaway train, about America's credibility crisis, about these deep vulnerabilities.
Well, what does that truly mean for the future? For alliances we've relied on for decades? For the very idea of national security when maybe military might or economic power isn't the whole story anymore?
And if these huge shifts, maybe even an economic implosion, aren't just abstract threats, but potentially, as Macgregor warns, much closer than we think.
Yeah.
What does that imply for us? Individually and collectively, what kind of preparations, what kind of mindset is needed?
Serious questions, ones that go far beyond today's headlines. It really leaves you with a lot to mull over as you watch events unfold.